Is there a natural limit to how much muscle we can build?
Year 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. You're looking at 1 to 2 pounds of muscle per year.
So once you reach your genetic limit,
Someday, Geoffrey is going to be on steroids. It's only a matter of time.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Smart Simple Fit. Today, we've got a special episode for you. We'll be joined by Geoffrey Verity Schofield. We're the most jacked, stacked, and juicy natties on YouTube Fitness that there is. Geoffrey has an impressive training history, and he's achieved a level of muscularity that I think any natty who's serious about making long-term gains should aspire to achieve. He's also authored several books, which have done very well. So, Geoffrey, thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Doing well.
Awesome. So before we get started on the topics for today, I was hoping you'd give just sort of a brief rundown of your training history. Maybe explain to the audience if there are some big changes that have happened along the way, sort of what's changed over the years, and then maybe if you want to give us a little glimpse on what your aspirations for the future are, you could tell us a little bit about that too. So, yeah, take us back to the start.
Well, I was originally actually a distance runner. So for the first 10 years of training, I didn't really lift weights. I mean, maybe very, very briefly, like occasionally Bulgarian split squats or something. But that's about all. Like no squats, no deadlifts, certainly no bench press, because I was actually trying to lose weight. I was trying to get skinnier because I was like 150 pounds at 6 feet tall and pretty lean. But then I was trying to, I was looking at the Kenyans who were faster than me, and they were like 120 pounds, 110 pounds even, 130 pounds maybe at the most. So I was trying to lose weight. So I was basically not eating very much and, running 10, 12, 15 miles a day, or more sometimes. And like the weight just wouldn't come off. And I was already super lean, and I just, just built built different, I guess, compared to what I wanted. And I was still pretty quick, but not world class, right? I don't really talk about my distance running times very much because I don't have any proof of it. It's almost like the guy who benched 4 or 5 in high school, right? It's you could talk about the times that you ran in workouts and stuff, but no one was there. I didn't really run with a team; it was just myself. So I don't really talk about my times, but I was good, but not quite world class. Like sort of getting towards there, but sometimes what you're good at and what you're passionate about don't quite overlap. And so, I trained harder as a runner than I do as a lifter, which might surprise some people, but I really almost trained too hard. Actually, I trained myself into the ground. So that was sort of the first 10 years from about 15 years old up to around 25 years old. And so I had a hell of a base. I had like a 30 to 32 resting heart rate in the morning, which doesn't even make sense to most people because, they probably have, 60 or 70 resting heart rate. I think anything below 60 is sinus bradycardia. So when I get my physical and I have below a 60 resting heart rate still, it's like a medical condition. So, imagine when I was a runner, if I came into the hospital and they measured, maybe in the middle of the day walking around like a 35 or a 40, they probably would have thought there was something wrong with me or something. But it's just you get an enlarged heart, an athletic heart from doing lots and lots of just aerobic activity, like hard aerobic activity. Because it was, I don't really have the ability to do easy runs. Like it'll start easy and then it'll get progressively more difficult as the run goes on, even if I'm really tired. So I kind of just overdid it as a runner. And I think if I could go back, I would change a lot of things about how I train there. So that was sort of the first 10 years of my life. And then I was really injured, really beaten up. I had a sports hernia. I had just a lot of really, really minor overuse injuries. And I was kind of getting slower over time, which was not a great feeling. And so I kind of just sort of tried my hand at lifting. And I think the first 4 months, I went from 68 kilos, so 150-ish pounds, up to 79 kilos. So I gained 11 kilos in 4 months.
Oh
Yeah.
big
And it was not all muscle, you know.
Yeah.
But it was a pretty decent amount of muscle in terms of like muscle to fat ratio. And that was just from eating a lot of food, not doing an insane volume of weight training, and then just training, you know. And so whenever I hear someone who's like, oh, slow twitch endurance athletes, they can't gain muscle, I just doesn't even, because I see it all the time actually. Guys who have a good base of endurance and are just generally physically prepared to recover and, you know, to put in the work. They have the work capacity, but also the recovery capacity from just the bed of dense capillaries that I, you know, had spent a decade developing. You know, you can grow for sure if you eat. That's the thing. I always had a big appetite, which was made things difficult trying to go down in weight. But it was almost like a relief being able to go up in weight as a lifter. So it was almost a complete 180, and I took to it pretty well. And then, you know, it's been about almost 9 years of lifting. It'll be 9
Well,
years.
I've seen quite a few clips of obviously your lifting, but also some running that you'll do. You know, even just it looks like throughout the city and the region that you're from. So over the years since you started more focusing on weight training, have you kept much of the running in there, or you know, have some injuries gotten in the way, or just priorities change? What's that been like for
It's
you?
Yeah, good question. I don't really do hybrid training. I get asked about that sometimes. Like I'll post a clip of me running, but I don't do hybrid training. I wouldn't really call it that, because I don't prioritize running at all. Right? It'll be something I do on a whim, or like one day the gym was closed because the staff had like some team meeting or some team outing or something, and so the gym was closed. So I'm like, all right, well, I guess I'll run, and so I just ran instead. Um, and I still enjoy it, but there's a big difference running at 220 versus 150. Like it's just it's very different. So in terms of like avoiding overuse, I just can't. But I couldn't run 70, 80 miles a week now. Um, Maybe if I built up to it, but I kind of doubt it. Um, like having a lot of miles in your legs is good for your cardiovascular system, but I think in terms of just the wear and tear and the toll it takes, definitely also is a thing. And I actually saw a bunch of the masters world records. So like guys who were 60, 70, 80 years old, and most of them were not lifetime runners. They were guys who picked it up later in life, and they'd only been training like 5 or 10 years. So they were just a little bit fresher, you know? So we like to think that, oh, the longer you spend doing something, the better you're going to get at it infinitely. Well, in terms of fitness, maybe, but there's also a cost, I think. And a lot of these little aches and pains and niggles and stuff, the body can adapt to a lot, but it can't adapt to everything. And that's where I think I definitely overdid it at some points.
Well, it'd be an interesting concept, right? We often not only think about experience as helping us be prepared and not necessarily hurting us through years of little things, right, adding up, but also with the age thing, we think of age is often talked about as being this big barrier, right? Like fitness after 40, how do I train after 50, right? But like you're saying, these guys are going into it pretty fresh. So that's something to be said.
Yeah, I think I don't want to use age as an excuse. Like I never want to say something and then have people like, well, guess I won't be able to do that. I think it's just something to keep in mind and to be aware of. It's almost like getting injured in the gym. You know, I don't go into any session like super, super cautious because I'd never get anything done, right? It's impossible to get productive weight training in if you're just like super, super timid and cautious about it. And that's where, the people who fearmonger and they're like, oh, if you internally rotate or if you, round your back a slight amount, oh, you're going to get injured. It creates this barrier to hard work. But you have to balance those as well, because if you do nothing but hard work and you're just throwing weight around without knowing your body or without knowing which positions that you can get into safely, then you're kind of just asking for it. And I've noticed most lifters have at least one big injury where it prevented them from doing what they wanted to do, and then they had to be smarter in the future. So I've had mine. I tore my QL about a year and a half ago almost, and so that lingered for almost a year. I mean, that lingered for probably 8 or 9 months, where I couldn't barbell squat, I couldn't barbell deadlift. I mean, I could barely put my shoes the first week or so or two. And so, a lot of lessons were learned there. And I'm certainly more cautious than I was before, but I'm not so cautious that, I'm going in, I'm like, using the tweezers on the pig dumbbells and, trying to make gains from sets of 50 or something like that, right? It has to be balanced with the effective training as well.
You don't spend 45 minutes warming up.
No, but I do spend a good amount of time, right? Like I'm on some movements, my warm-ups will blend into my working sets.
Oh yeah.
So I will, I'm actually a fan of pyramiding up at the moment. So, I might do like warm-up sets of 20 to 30, and then I'll just go up and wait until those are pretty hard sets of 20 to 30. And then as I keep going up, the weight will drop a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because that there are definitely a lot of people, and it's understandably so. They'll talk about doing the heaviest thing first, right? Maybe after like a warm-up set, something like that, doing your heaviest thing first and then like backing down sets. But what I found in experience, this sounds similar to what you're talking about pyramiding up, is that sometimes on a movement, if you do that lighter stuff first, those more higher reps, you're actually like really prepared for either the lower rep stuff at the end or stuff with a higher proximity to failure, especially on a movement like a squat, and especially if you have an injury history, that might really help you. And you can iron out some technical problems of the day if you notice a couple things and you fix them before you get to the heaviest or the hardest work. That might be a huge benefit. So you can definitely approach
For
it.
sure. And if it impacts your top sets, your heaviest sets, to me that's usually a sign that someone is not in the best shape. So if a few moderately hard sets of like 15 to 20 in the squat, not all out, but with a few reps in reserve, because that's still effective work in the squat, right? Sometimes, shocker, I keep reps in reserve on some movements actually, right? So I'm not like every set to failure, beyond failure. Oh, if they can't scrape you off the gym floor with a spatula, you wasn't hard enough. No, like a set of 15 with 3 reps in reserve, assuming it's genuinely 3 reps in reserve,
yeah,
that's pretty damn hard, and it's still effective. If that completely tanks your performance, then it's more of a work capacity issue than anything. And so what I always find it funny when people kind of call themselves out. They're like, man, pyramid training sucks. It really impacts your top set. I'm like, okay, well, you're kind of revealing your lack of work capacity there. It's like if someone says, oh, 2 minutes of recovery absolutely tanks performance. Okay, well, I guess you're in pretty bad shape then. So I think that way of training is pretty good. And those heavier sets are still, maybe they won't be as heavy, but maybe that's a good thing. If you have an injury where the absolute load is what pisses it off, which is often the case, being able to use a lighter weight, even just marginally, can be actually a blessing in disguise. Maybe it's not what the young guns want. They want to drive progression. They want to lift the heavy weight, no matter the cost, no matter the form. Taking a step back and learning to lift when a little bit fatigued actually makes sense. Like when I first saw Dorian Yates doing deadlifts at the end of his session, I was like, what is this idiot doing? It doesn't make any sense. And so, he was doing his barbell rows with like 4 plates and his deadlift with 4.5 plates. I mean, he could have, done 6 or maybe 7 or maybe even 8 plates at the start if he really wanted to. But I think he knew that it probably wasn't the best decision. And then you look at guys like Ronnie, who, still obviously both tremendous backs, two of the best in history. They just had different approaches, and they both got the job done. But maybe the costs were higher in one case rather than the other.
Definitely. I do that myself on a variety of workout types. I'll save the worst thing for the last because my thought process is, boy, when I'm done, I get to be done.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, it
Yeah.
just goes to show there's probably a lot less like rules for this whole working out thing than many might have you perceive. Sure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure.
as far as how you currently train, has it other than maybe your injury history and experience informing things, how you weight train now? How has that changed compared to when you were just getting into it years back?
So I would say it's more structured, but also less structured. So my week is more structured. So I basically do at least the same movement types on the same days, but I give myself more flexibility within those days. So if I need to move a movement or change the movement within the same movement pattern, usually I think that's okay. There's a few exceptions that I've found don't work as well, at least for me. More technical movements, something like an RDL. It's not that technical, but I found that I can't really swap anything else for it and just sort of pick up where I left off in terms of progression. I don't think it's that technical a movement. I think it's just the loading and exactly how it's done. It's not like you can take a couple weeks and go do good mornings and then come back to it and be stronger. Maybe some people can, but I never found that to be the case. Whereas like a curl variation, I mean, you can kind of swap those as you prefer. If someone is hugging the easy bar, you can use dumbbells or a machine or cables or something else. I think that's not really a big issue. Same thing with extensions, same thing with a lot of shoulder isolations. Those things are kind of just whatever you want, I guess. The exception might be as a beginner, you probably don't want to have too many variations because then you don't really know what the numbers mean. For me, I have a few variations that I kind of cycle through on my bro days, which is basically curls, extensions, and then shoulder isolation, and then some other like neck work, forearm work, just, kind of a random filler workout with the small stuff while I'm waiting for my lower body to recover for the next day. And I found that I probably have 3 to 5 variations for each movement pattern that I kind of just at this point just throw in there because I know roughly what weight I should use. My technique is pretty stable and pretty solid on those. But if someone's a beginner, they don't know what weights they should use. They don't really know their technique, etc. So they should probably have a little bit more structure in there. But when you're more advanced, yeah, a lot of the rules become more just suggestions, I guess, and pretty light suggestions at that. And so, yeah, that's kind of the difficulty of being a content creator where, I'm advanced. And so a lot of the things I do are not really appropriate for most people watching the channel. So I kind of have to have like a disclaimer whenever I post a story or, when I make a video, I try to remember, okay, like most people watching this are either beginners or intermediates, and there's some advanced, but that's kind of the minority. And so, yeah, I kind of have to think back to the issues I had as a beginner and talk to those more than I would like to talk to, because I would prefer to only talk about the stuff that I'm interested in, which would be what I'm currently sort of going through, I guess. But that won't be useful for the majority of people watching. So I kind of have to balance content for me versus content for everyone.
Interesting. And what would be just a couple examples or short list of what would be things that you consider appropriate for you now at this advanced stage that might not be so appropriate for the beginner?
So I would say the biggest one would be beyond failure type of stuff. So this might be you go to failure and then you add in partials at the end, or like stretched focus movements. So maybe you go to failure on overhead extensions, and then you add in partials in the mid range or partials at the stretch position, or cheat reps where you're using momentum to sort of drive through and get the weight up, and then you control the eccentric and drive through and control the eccentric. I found that stuff to be very useful, but it's also slightly riskier, and also it's not needed for most people, and also most people are going to mess it up when they do it, right? Because it's kind of a fine line between getting a lot out of that type of work and it just being useless, right? And I think most people, you have to be able to feel that, and it's something that I can do now, but I almost hesitate to put out that kind of content because I know some people are going to see it and then just be flailing around and not really controlling the weight, or they won't go to failure and then do partials or eccentrics or something. They'll just go 3, 4, 5, 6 reps in reserve, then start that. And so, they should just focus on going towards failure, not even to failure, just closer to it than they are, because that'll be much more useful. So, don't do beyond failure work until you can reliably train near failure and then to failure. And then maybe after a few years, you can add in this kind of advanced stuff. It's more of like a plateau buster. And if someone is hitting plateaus in their first year or two of training, I mean, that's a bigger issue. It could be diet, could be sleep, could be the overall training structure, could be a lot of things, dozens of things. But if someone is not progressing in the first year or two of training, I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, 4 straps, that's what's gonna, no, because that's just, it's going to be something else rather than just going beyond failure.
Right, right. And it might sound strange to some in the audience, right? The idea that like the cheat stuff and beyond failure is something that can and probably should be executed well. But I don't disagree. I think there's such a thing as like even like a controlled cheat. You're conscious of how much, like, what is the acceptable amount for me on this exercise and why, and then be consistent, whether it's a little bit of swing on that barbell curl, whatever it is, as long as it doesn't get too out of control and you're consistent with it, at the very least, it's an accurate base reference point for when you go to progress on that specific type of movement, right?
Yeah. So I can see it now. If I saw someone who was like, been lifting 15 years and was cheating, I can see the difference between that and a beginner who doesn't really know what they're doing. Very big difference. And it's pretty apparent just based on how they're moving, based on their rhythm, based on the bar speed. You can see if they're cheating to get more out of the set or just cheating because they think it's cool or cheating because they're trying to avoid failure. And they're very different things. And it does take a bit of an eye for it. But yeah, nowadays I can see if it's the good or the bad type. And so I would say I'm pretty good about keeping it as the good type. It's a skill, it's a skill. We don't really hear about hypertrophy training as being a skill. It's more like powerlifting is a skill. Well, being able to put yourself in the right positions and to keep tension on the right muscles while you are in exquisite pain and going beyond failure and you're just sort of holding on, but you want to get the most out of the set. I mean, that's a skill. That's a skill. And it'll take, hundreds of times to get that down. And it's always something that you have to really focus on. If you don't have to really focus on what you're doing, probably doing it wrong, because it does take both a lot of effort, but then a lot of focus on making it difficult. I think that's the key where, if you're doing like a chest fly, for me, like I have to keep really a lot of focus on the chest to keep the tension where I want it. Because, I'll shrug up and the front delts will come into play, or like the abs will come into play, or the biceps will start to get in there, or even the triceps. So there's a lot of stuff that will happily take the tension, especially if it's a weak point. So whether it's back training or chest training or arm training or leg training, I mean, there are dozens of ways to fuck it up. And so it takes a lot of time and practice to put that tension where you actually want it.
Absolutely. And maybe that's more the art side of the training, especially like you said, hypertrophy training. And it's not something that's going to be well spoken for, at least not yet anyway, in the realm of like actual science. But on the bro science side, I think it's fair that when you look at these advanced guys, whether it's Dorian or Mike Menser, or that doesn't really matter who, they're all going to have kind of their own thing where they do a little bit of that. There's little nuances, there's little idiosyncrasies, like a little trademark thing that they do. You know, for someone, it might be the way they do a barbell curl with a bit of a cheat. For Mike Menser, it's taking things to failure and then doing that like 15-second hold at the end of the set. Like they all kind of have their little trademark thing, but they're preparing for that with experience. And even someone like Menser is going to say, hey, this isn't, taking your sets this hard really isn't great for everyone. Like it works really well, but there are people that are not going to respond well to this. And same people, recommending back squat who are really like really into back squatting or say, well, you don't have to back squat, right? There are alternatives. And even the GOAT himself, Tom Platz, is famous not only for his squat, his beautiful squat, but also the hack squat and doing it in a rather like unique and kind of extreme way, right? He's getting the knees like way past the toes, the heels come up, right? So even that guy who's like a classic, the barbell is all you need. Well, he's actually taking advantage of machines and he's pushing it way harder than almost anyone is willing to on a machine at that.
Yeah, no, it's I he was enhanced, and a lot of these guys you mentioned are enhanced,
Yeah.
but I do think that there's some relevancy. I think there's some trend in the natural community to just completely toss out everything enhanced lifters say just because they're enhanced. And I think maybe there's some wasted information there. Like I saw some guy, it was actually an Instagram advertisement, I think. And, I was flicking through, and so I saw it and I paused, and clearly very enhanced, very juicy. And he was giving good advice, which kind of surprised me because often I was expecting, because often, yeah, it is bad advice. But it was good advice. It was very reasonable. And I was like, wow, that was refreshing. Like he was giving some good technique advice. Very well spoken. I actually didn't follow the guy because it was an ad, just had a principle, I guess. But it seemed very reasonable advice. And then I go to the comments, and all the comments were like trend, oh, syringe emoji, oh yeah, what about the drugs? What about, and I was just thinking like, man, that sucks. That sucks. And I try to have empathy even, for people who are enhanced. They're still people. I mean, they're still lifters, most importantly, right? So they deserve, at least some respect. And and I felt bad for the guy because he was giving good advice, but people were just focusing. It's almost like the pendulum has shifted a little bit too much. And so yeah, when I watched Platz train, yeah, I think you can take some aspects of that and certainly apply it to natural lifting. People say, but we're natural, we could never recover from that. But I mean, that doesn't make sense at all, right? I mean, you can recover from a lot as a natural. You might need to tweak the volume, but I wouldn't tweak the effort. I wouldn't lower the effort and like up the volume or lower the effort and be worried about recovery or like my Fitbit said my heart rate is up 3 beats a minute, so I better take the day off. Yeah, okay.
Right. My magic ring tells me it's not a good idea.
yeah. No, it's I don't know. People will, I don't know. I don't advise most of that kind of stuff, but I actually used to have a Fitbit just because I like nerding out about the numbers and stuff. But yeah, in terms of like practical decision making, I don't think it was that useful. it was fun to see, but yeah, in terms of the usefulness, I don't know. But yeah, when I see Platz train, yeah, there's a lot of useful stuff there. Like when he's doing pull-ups and he's like, yanking down and trying to like tear the lats, basically. I've tried doing that kind of stuff where you attach two of those D handles and with a wide grip, and then you're just trying to stretch the lats around the scapula and up, all through the teres major, and then you're just sort of jumping up and you're trying to go beyond failure and you're trying to lower yourself as slowly as possible. And so, yeah, I see some enhanced lifters, but it's mostly from like the 60s and 70s. I think once you get into the 80s and the 90s, you get a little bit more fluff and pump. Maybe some super talented guys who just, they're lifting less weight than me and they're twice my size. And I'm not even that strong. And so when I see that kind of stuff, I'm just, I don't know. You can try to train that like that as a natural, but if you're 12 reps from failure or more and it's just the pink dumbbells, I don't know. I just don't see that happening. Like there was this guy at my old gym. I could tell he was enhanced not from his size, but from the weights he was using. He had this just ridiculous chest, and he was dumbbell bench pressing like 40 pounds per hand. I was just thinking,
must be nice.
Yeah. How does that? I don't know. Just, yeah. And he had the look, and you can kind of tell once you talk to someone or see them train, and they get the gains, but there's a price down the road.
Absolutely, there is. And if there's anything that made Platts unique, not just like his amazing quotes and his gigantic thighs, but he brought a level of aggression to the sets that is like next to none. The facial expressions, the screaming, that famous clip of the leg extension machine that's like the bolts are loose and it's coming out of the ground. And
Yeah.
that's something that we can aspire to. But obviously it's got to be justified, the aggression in the set. And I'm one on my channel. I preach like doing controlled reps, often slow controlled reps, but I don't want to give the impression that people also shouldn't work hard. And, you should be kind of like grunting, or you're famous for your facial expressions, I think, to some degree, by the time you're done your sets. That's good. You shouldn't be able to maintain like a stoic look with no drops of sweat coming down. That's a problem if you can maintain that through your workout, right? So there's something to be said about the aggression, it being the thing that makes you stand out from the other people in the gym, getting those extra gains.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, like you mentioned, controlled reps and then also aggressive reps. I think you can kind of have a blend of the two. That's kind of what I prefer to go with. Just controlled aggression. So the concentric is it's aggressive. It's you're trying to really accelerate the weight. If I'm doing just about any movement, I'm trying to move that concentric as fast as I can. I think on the eccentric, that's where you want the control, especially down into that end range of motion, especially for something like a biceps or a pec or something. I think that's where, having some risk aversion, or just watching a bunch of like fails on YouTube about like, people tearing shit.
Yeah.
It probably won't happen to you, but it could. And, seeing the similarities of like, oh, super deep preacher curls for heavy weight. Like, okay, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And so, there are some movements that I'm more cautious with, especially getting towards that lengthened position. But, when I'm really trying to lift the weight, I might start that first part of the range of motion a little bit controlled. But once I'm into the mid range, that's where I'm really just giving it everything I have. And, I think biomechanics has been quite useful because I know which movements are appropriate to push and which are better to be a little bit more conservative on. And I've really only had that one injury, which, you learn from and it kind of sucks, but then, you use it to get better. But, people will kind of assume, oh, you must have tons of injuries. Well, not really, because it's aggressive, but it's controlled where it needs to be controlled, right? Like you're not going to get injured in most of the range of motion. Usually it's a specific part. And as long as you're slowing the weight down and feeling that end range of motion, maybe pausing it, trying to make it difficult, right? Because it's easy to just bounce around, but it's harder to really control it into that length position, then drive it up, then control it down, then drive it up. And so it's almost like a piston. Actually, that's what Tom Platz used to say. when he was squatting is like a piston, just straight up and down. And that's often what I'm doing when I'm lifting. It's just like it's a piston. So it's constant tension, but it's the stretch and the contraction. But the eccentric is difficult, the concentric is difficult, the stretch is difficult, the contraction, it's all difficult. Right. And I think that's where you get the most out of a set, where there's no breaks, there's no easy part. You're cheating enough where the concentric is difficult, but the eccentric is also difficult. And so, yeah, it is an art.
Well, and you say you emphasize the difficulty of it all. I think that's probably where we can see a lot of people go wrong in their training, Jeff, both in terms of like not controlling the weight on the way down, using too much weight, too little weight, right? Staying too shy of failure. Like these are all examples of avoiding an aspect of training that's difficult and kind of sucks, right? If you're going too heavy all the time, maybe you're trying to avoid the burn. You're just trying to get things over with. It's ego, so you're avoiding the difficulty of, at the very least, putting in the proper time to justify the weights, or on the way down, you just want to be able to be justified in lifting more weight on the concentric, staying away from failure. You want the gains without, feeling like you did a ton of work. So no matter how you slice it, if you avoid the difficult stuff, it's probably going to come back to bite you, isn't it?
Yeah, there's no way to get around that difficulty. And so I don't want to say harder than last time because that's overly simplistic and it's not particularly useful. Like, oh yeah, what should I do in training? Harder than last time. Like it's just it's not actually very actionable. But it's not entirely wrong either, because you look around a typical commercial gym, man, you see a lot of bored looking people just on their phone. I saw a guy on his phone doing leg extensions. Not going to be doing very much past a month of beginner gains, right? And so, yeah, that focus, that aggression, that intention, the technique, and those slow, grindy reps where, yeah, they're really, really, really challenging, and gun to your head, you couldn't have gotten another. Yeah, I think those are going to be the useful reps. And when I hear, oh yeah, 3 reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, 0 reps in reserve failure, like it all comes out in the wash. Well, yeah, that's because the wash is a scientific study where the studies are all totally different. They're not particularly well controlled in a lot of cases on a huge variety of people. A lot of them are untrained, and they make gains from cardio. And if you make gains from cardio, sure, you might make gains from 2, 3 reps in reserve, 4 reps in reserve, 5 reps in reserve, but that's because your baseline is a beginner, a novice, someone who's completely fresh to training. And sure, maybe for that person, 0 reps in reserve is equal to 2 or 3 reps in reserve, because 0 reps in reserve is something so novel to them, it's excessive. It's just too much damage, it's too much stress. They can't really adapt to it as readily over a 4, 8, 6-week study. And so sure, like maybe that's equal on paper in some circumstances to 3 reps in reserve. But when you talk to advanced lifters who are jacked, and you're like, so 0 reps in reserve, 3 reps in reserve, same thing, right? You know what I'm saying? They're like, what do you, no, like what? Like 3 reps in reserve, I mean, it's suitable in some movements, but it's not the same as 0 reps in reserve. Yeah. It's mind-blowing. This is just another example of where science comes out with some kind of finding, which is very, very at odds with what a lot of people who have actually been lifting for a long time have discovered. And then science often has this hubris, which doesn't think that it could be wrong. And it says that the people doing the thing are wrong and that they should, change what they're doing, even though what they're doing has been getting them, the actual results in the real world. And that's where it kind of pisses me off. And, I noticed that all of the science-based guys that I follow and respect and actually like listen to their information, they were all lifters first, right? They might be PhDs, they might, have their masters, they might be extremely deep in the literature, but they were lifters first, right? So I think you need that actual practical experience. I mean, if you go out and read a bunch of papers on hypertrophy, but you've never done hypertrophy training, I just don't think you're going to be able to have those guardrails in place in terms of the recommendations that you give. And often you'll say something that's very, very at odds for what most people do. And most people are like, well, that doesn't really jive with what most people experience. And just like, oh, well, that's the study. That's what the study says. And there's really no further conversation there. It's just, oh, here's the link.
Yeah.
Here's the link to the study. Like, okay, well, I was expecting, to have some kind of, not even an argument, not even a debate, just a conversation
A meaningful
about,
discussion.
yeah, just why this didn't really, why are lifters not doing this?
Yeah.
Because if 3 reps in reserve was really the same as 0 reps in reserve, I would happily do 3 reps in reserve. It's much easier because those are the last 3 reps. They take the longest, they're the most challenging. I mean, in a set of 10, the last 3 reps, that could easily be half the set in terms of the time that it takes. And it's the most difficult time. So, I mean, a set of 7 with your 10 rep max, that's not that difficult on most movements. Maybe like a squat or an RDL, it's fairly challenging.
Oh,
But on a bench press with 3 reps in reserve, I mean, it's not that challenging. And so if you can get the same results with very, very easy in comparison training, I would think, and it's going to be safer, right? It's probably going to be less risky, a lot less fatigue. And so why are lifters going to failure? Is it just because they're meatheads and they're dumb and they don't understand anything? No, it's because I saw better results going to failure, right? And so it just blows my mind sometimes, the hubris that some of these science-based guys can have. And you look at guys like Helms, guys like Nippert, guys like Benno Henselmans. I mean, yeah, they were lifters first, and they use science, but they do balance it with that practical experience, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah. They it has to taper the ideas, right? You can't get by with just theories, just ideas. You got to put these things not only to the test in science, but your own experience, maybe with clients if you coach like we do, and just pay attention to what's out there. Like you said, who are these like big jack dudes? Someone might add a qualifier of NATTY. I think that's probably a good idea. But even then, as we were just talking a moment ago, you can learn a lot from the enhanced guys. So don't even be in a hurry to shove that in the garbage. And that's extremely important. And I think one of the limits too, Jeff, in addition to the hubris of science, is the mindset's very like analytical in the number sense, and it's very clinical. Like it's very like sanitized and kind of like robotic. It loses some of that art form, and it's not as like interpersonal. Like if you're with your buddies in the gym and you don't even mean it in an insulting way, and you're squatting and buddy's squatting, and he's good. He's good for another rep or two. You're gonna be like, oh come on, man, don't be a sissy. Do another rep. But what you don't see in the studies is participants responded very well to being told not to be a sissy. It's like that's not a part of the process. So
yeah, no, it is quite clinical, and I think it causes people to overthink during the set. And it's just, people are like, oh, should my joint angle be here? Like I read this study, the incline bench was supposed to be 28 degrees, but then, I measured it in the gym, and actually this one, the notch is a little bit higher, so it was 32 degrees. I wasn't sure if that's okay, and I think I might actually prefer 47 degrees, and I tried it, but I wasn't sure, and I was wondering if you could send me a meta-analysis on the chest hypertrophy growth based on, and also, like I've been training 3.5 years, and I'm not really growing at all, so I was just wondering if it's my diet. And like, it's okay to think, but don't think during the set, right? Like you should get to the point where it's unconscious competence. We have this sort of 4-wheel chart, maybe you're familiar with it, where you start out and you are unconsciously incompetent. So you suck at something, but you don't know you suck at something, basically. And then, as you keep doing it, you slowly realize, wow, I actually suck at this. I'm actually really not good at all. And so you become consciously incompetent. You're still incompetent, but you're incompetent, which is, I guess, in some ways better. It might not feel as good. The Dunning-Kruger effect has gone, but at least and can maybe get better. And so you practice over the course of, depends on the skill, could be weeks, could be months, could be years. And you become consciously competent. So you can do the thing, you're good at the thing, but you still have to sort of think about doing the thing when you're doing the thing. Eventually, it becomes unconscious. You don't have to think about it. It's just something you do. You don't have to think about, oh, is my elbow doing this? Like, what about my shoulders? What about my feet? What about my neck? Like, what am I doing when I'm dumbbell bench pressing? Like, I heard the scapula should be doing something. Can I actually keep the shoulders? Can I pop it? What about my glutes? What about my feet?
Good.
What
Arch
about
back,
yeah. So it's like people just think too much, but eventually you just do it. You just do the thing. You don't have to actually think about it at all. And I think that's the point where you want to get to. And if you ever look at an elite athlete demonstrate something, they have to think about how to explain it because they don't have to think about it. And often they haven't had to think about it in a really long time. And often this is why great athletes make really bad coaches, because sometimes they're so gifted that they went through that journey in like a few weeks or a few months, and now they just completely forgot about that journey, a few years later. And so when someone's like, oh, so like a tennis backhand, how should I do this? And so they're like, well, I just do this. And they can show it, but they can't really explain it because, they've lost that ability. Or they'll try to demonstrate it the wrong way, like, don't do this. And you'll have to see them like really focus on doing it the wrong way. So they have to focus on doing it the wrong way more than doing it the right way, even if the right way might be more difficult for most people, right? And so I've seen a few like tennis players, teach tennis and say like, you should not do this. And you have to watch them like really sort of like think back to what they do and then like do it the wrong way, but they have to really focus on doing it the wrong way. And so it's the same thing with lifting. Like if I was demonstrating something and I was doing it the wrong way, I would have to really focus on what I was doing more than if I just did it the right way. And I can usually explain things fairly well, but maybe that's because I was a teacher and I'm a coach. But yeah, a lot of lifters, they don't know how to explain things that well because they've been lifting for so long that it's just unconscious competence.
Yep. And there's something to be said about the feel as well, right? If something just kind of feels natural and you're always doing it, maybe you never put that much thought into it. You're like, well, this, and then it kind of feels like that, and you're like trying to put words to an experience. But like you said with the athlete, that's a great example. The tennis, they've never really necessarily had to. So now they're like trying to go in and like they're on the spot trying to break down what's happening.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are like amputees below the neck. They just like they have no sensation or feeling about positioning or like what their body is doing. And so, if you say like, oh, where do you feel this? They don't really feel it anywhere, right? Okay, so where you feeling this in like your chest? Or they're just like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of that means. And so, usually if someone has an athletic background, they know what you mean and they can, provide that information and it's easier to communicate. But if someone has just never used their body, it's like they have to develop those neural pathways and the metabolic conditioning. So sometimes someone will be really insensitive to training. Like they'll fail out of nowhere and like they won't feel it anywhere and they won't really be getting activation anywhere. And then in other cases, someone will be super sensitive to training. Like they'll do a set of 5 cable crossovers and then be like, oh, my chest, it's destroyed. Oh, it's burning so much. And they're just like, they accumulate waste products really, really easily or something. Or maybe maybe they don't even have more waste products. They're really sensitive to them because they've never like used their body or done anything really physically strenuous. And so the minute they get like some kind of sensation that for me would be like, all right, we're getting after it, we're starting the set. Like when they have the same physiological situation, for them it's like their body's freaking out and their mind is also freaking out because those are connected. And so they're like, oh man, that was the hardest set ever. And that's another thing. I can go back and look at sets from 5 years ago, and I knew it was 0 reps in reserve then, but if I put my brain in my old body, I could have gotten more reps now. Just because you get used to pushing hard and you get used to taking like more and more reps when you didn't think you could. And, I think that's something not that talked about with the reps in reserve debate. Like you can get better at taking more reps and taking them safely over time.
Yeah, for sure. Now and here's something I'd like to hear your thoughts on, and this is related to that whole 3 in reserve. Oh, it's the same as 0 in reserve. Aside from maybe the exception of lifting very heavy on compound movements for the sake of showing off, where a person might be tempted to do an extra rep when they and their coach know it's not a good idea. Like, hey, follow the program, don't hurt yourself. But aside from that exception, the experienced person doing low reps on compounds, would you agree with this statement if I said where you should take your sets in general, especially for the sake of hypertrophy, is not necessarily to a magic RPE or beyond failure, not failure. Forget about that. It's more reps than you want to do. Like if you're about to do 15, you want to stop at 10 because it sucks by 10. But those last 5, they're so worth doing it because they're probably your driver of progress. They're what's going to set you up to do eventually 16, maybe next week, right? Would you agree with that? It's about doing more reps than you want to.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that. And it might have been Arnold, it might have been someone else. He said he started counting when it started hurting, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. In a lot of ways, the first reps are just a warm up. They're just getting you in a position to where it's difficult, you know? And so whether it's heavy and difficult, whether it's light and difficult, whether it's medium and difficult, I mean, if it's not difficult, it's probably not doing that much. And you could also take this to where some movements are inherently difficult. Therefore, you probably don't have to take them as close to failure. So if you look at something like a squat, that's always difficult, right? Even 3 reps in reserve, it's still pretty damn difficult. And so, it's better to treat that differently compared to something like a dumbbell spider curl, right? Where it's a small amount of muscle mass, relatively speaking. Well, maybe not for me. And so it's contraction focused. So it's it's difficult at the top part of the range of motion, whereas a squat, it's most difficult sort of in the bottom half of the range of motion. And it's not axially loaded, whereas a squat is. It's not nearly as heavy as a squat, not as much muscle mass, nowhere even close. And so, yeah, I would say a spider curl make failure like almost your starting point in some ways. Like you go to where you can barely get it up, you barely get it up, and then you do a few more where you're getting as much range of motion as you can. You're just sort of you're failing because you are not able to get that top most difficult part of the range of motion. Whereas with a squat, I mean, I would never recommend someone squat until you get a grindy rep, and then go back down to the bottom and just go up as high as you can a few times. Like it just doesn't make sense, right? From a risk reward standpoint, or maybe from a stimulus to fatigue standpoint. They're very different beasts. You look at an RDL. Would you use partials on an RDL? Some people actually have. I've seen Alberto Nunez use them. I think Milo Wolf has also used them. The king of partials himself. And I think if you're advanced and you know yourself and your positioning and you know how to stay braced, sure, I think you can experiment with that kind of stuff. But yeah, for the average person, probably not the best idea. And so, there's going to be a huge spectrum of movements to where they're very failure friendly, to where they're not particularly failure friendly at all. And most of the power lifts, they're not that failure friendly. You don't want to fail a barbell bench. I've done that. It's not fun. You don't want to fail a barbell squat. Again, I mean, that can go very, very badly, A barbell deadlift, I mean, at least it's not going to be life threatening typically, but, you usually people will break down in some area of the kinetic chain, usually rounding in the upper or lower back, and that can be injurious for some people, especially when near failure, or in this case beyond failure. I mean, it's already beyond technical failure if you're rounding more the last few reps of a set compared to the first, right? So if your technique is breaking down on squat, bench, deadlift, I think in most cases it doesn't really make sense to continue because you're already technically beyond technical failure. And I think the juice just is not worth the squeeze, you know? I think that's part of the reason why powerlifters use accessories, because you can't just dump all of your super hard training into SBD because they bite back pretty damn hard, which is why RPE, RIR came from powerlifting, right? Like this wasn't bodybuilders using RIR originally. You know, if you went to most bodybuilders and were like, RIR, they'd be like, what do you mean? I just go to failure because I picked the movements that are suitable to go to failure. Like, that makes sense, right? But with powerlifting, yeah, you know, that's where keeping multiple reps on reserve, even 5 or 6 reps on reserve, I think if it's heavy enough, you know, doing singles at 85%, for a lot of people, that's 6 or 7 reps on reserve, but that's still quite productive if you do it frequently, or if you do enough of it, you know, you really dial in the technique, grease the groove, etc. And so, yeah, I think treating each movement as it is really important. That's going to vary a little bit from individual to individual. Some people are super resilient. They actually can dump a lot of their volume into barbell, squat, bench, deadlift. You look at, I think, Taylor Atwood, I think a lot of his volume was the competition lifts. And he was just, you know, he's exceptionally durable, I guess. But that's not the average person. I would say at least half of the population, you have them put a whole bunch of volume into barbell, squat, bench, deadlift, and you know, you'll see issues pretty quickly, which is why accessory lifts are a thing for powerlifters. And if you're not a powerlifter, I mean, you can do those lifts if you like, if you want them, if you really want them in your program. But you know, I don't barbell deadlift anymore. I do RDLs. I don't low bar back squat. I do high bar or front squats or leg press or Smith machine hack squats or hack squats. Just because they're easier on the body, and I get what I actually want out of them, right? It's almost like saying goodbye to an old friend when you stop barbell back squatting. It's like, you know, it's taken a long time to warm up, but you know, due to the imbalances I have, it's just, you know, it's more efficient to do other things. And so, and then barbell bench I do occasionally, but I'm kind of getting away from that as well, just because I just haven't found it to be as productive as other things, you know. And if your goal is hypertrophy, I see a lot of people who probably secretly wish they'd kicked those movements to the curb a little bit earlier, or at least maybe dialed the effort on those back a little bit, and put the effort into something that was a little bit easier on the body.
Yeah, I think something else you see too with the compounds, not only there's a reason to have accessories to dump more training economy into to make sure it's productive, safe, and all that stuff, but also you see a difference, I would say, in like volume prescriptions, where it's like very common to have 5 or more sets on a main lift in a powerlifting program, but what you see is like a compensation for that higher volume versus say maybe 2 to 4 sets that someone might do on a hypertrophy program. You see the effort is lower, like you're saying. You can get away with that low low RPE. And actually, people will talk about doing a volume inversion as a good strategy, even for something like on a deadlift, of like practicing wedging and getting your hips in the right position on the first rep. So if you do 3 sets of 8, that's great if you can handle that with good form. But if you do 8 sets of 3, that's more opportunities to get a first rep. And I would argue that 8 sets of 3, 3 sets of 8, even from a hypertrophy standpoint, fatigue, probably aren't that different, right? Like it's all sort of going to balance out to a degree. I don't want to say it's exactly the same, but to a degree, it's like because the set's easier, I don't need to rest as long, so I can get through it. I can get to the next set faster. So it's not a guarantee that 8 sets of 3 takes longer than 3 sets of 8. They're the same total number of reps. And as far as like fatigue, you're probably going to feel really good on most of those sets until you get to like your last couple sets of three. You'd actually be surprised how hard those last couple sets of three are. And just like in the same way that those last few reps on each of those sets would have been hard, right? Like it kind of comes back around. And far be it for me to say one of those is better than the other, or you have to be exactly somewhere in the middle or something like that. But you can absolutely, what it demonstrates, you can absolutely play with variables to get the outcome that you're looking for. In this case, it's addressing technique on the deadlift. For some people, it might be safety, how their joints feel. You mentioned absolute load being relevant. I think that's very relevant for injuries. But the point is, what you do has consequences, and you need to take those into consideration and then reflect that in the rest of your training, what those implications are.
Yeah, so for the 3x8 versus 8x3, would
Yeah.
the weight be the same? You mean?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be, I guess, that would be a big issue, because, yeah, I think Schoenfeld did a study. Here I am quoting studies where he compared. I think it was, yeah, it was triples versus sets of 10. So I think it was like 8x3 versus 3x10 or something, and the hypertrophy was the same, but the triples group was a lot heavier because they were equating the effort, the proximity to failure, and the 8x3, or maybe it was the 10x3, but it was triples.
Mhm.
They reported a lot more joint pain, and the session took way longer, like 3 or 4 times as long. But that's because it was heavier. Yeah, I think if you equate the weight, then yeah, your points definitely stand. The main thing would be to realize the first few sets of 3 are going to feel pretty easy because you could do more reps. Yeah, it's just that you have to realize that for powerlifting training, feeling like you could do more is totally fine. And it's just an opportunity, as you said, to really dial in the technique. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm not very good at powerlifting training, because I'll do an 8x3 or 10x3, but the first set will look like death, and then the second set will look like death, and all the sets will look pretty much the same, but they'll all be like 3 reps with my 4 rep max or something, right? You shouldn't be able to do 10 sets of 3 with your 4 rep max, but I've definitely done it before, where it's like every single set is, the last rep is a grinder, but then, you take a couple minutes, you walk around, and, you can almost like dial in the technique when you're doing the workout. But I would always just push too hard too early. And I think if you're doing like triples at 92 or 93%, it's just too heavy to really progress long term. Because what do you do next week? You add 5 pounds, 10 pounds? Like, I think Alexander Bromley gives the analogy of you're trying to drive a car out of a mud pit, or no, across a mud pit. You don't want to start right up against the mud pit. No, you want to back up and then generate enough momentum to really drive through it. And so, yeah, if you're doing a powerlifting block, a strength block, the first few weeks feeling easy is actually totally fine. So it's actually kind of the opposite to hypertrophy in a lot of ways.
So it's on the related to the topic of proximity to failure and volume, all this stuff. You had mentioned stimulus to fatigue and things like that. How do you try and manage fatigue now that you're a more advanced lifter as you're getting more jacked and stacked? And what do you think is the relevance of fatigue management in beginners? Is it something to think about much at all? Is this a more advanced concept? What are your thoughts on that in general?
So I do manage fatigue more than I used to, but I also don't need to manage it that much. I think part of that is because I'm not that strong. Like if I was 50% stronger and I was doing, RDLs with 500 pounds and, squats with high bar squats for reps for like with, 400, 500 pounds, if I was doing bench press for sets of 10 with mid 300s, I mean, it's just more fatiguing, right? It's not linear. I don't think it's linear to where it's like, you look at John Hack, someone who's literally twice as strong as me, I don't think he's generating twice as much fatigue with his maximal deadlift compared to mine. I think it's probably like 5 times as much or 10 times as much. Like it's like an order of magnitude more fatigue when you double the strength, right? Something like that. I don't know. It's a very rough formula that I just made up. But but
Source, I made it up.
yeah, I just pulled that out of my ass. But I think me not being that strong is definitely relevant here. And as I get stronger, fatigue management will probably become more of a thing. But I haven't had to focus on it too much. This might be because of my endurance background, so I can recover pretty well. Um, people say, "Oh, you must have been sore for a week after that workout," and I'm like, "Nah, maybe a little bit the next day, a slight 2 days later, but then good to go." And the repeated bout effect is very powerful, very very powerful. If I add in a new movement and I do 6 hard sets of it or something, yeah, I might get super sore. Like my hamstrings are really sore right now because I added in a new movement, um, like a walking single leg RDL, which messed me up. I didn't do 6 sets; I did 3 sets, but that was enough to get me sore. But I mostly stick to the same movements in the same sort of rotations, and so my body is pretty much used to it. And so, the repeated bout effect takes care of a lot of the fatigue, and then just eating well, sleeping well, maintaining reasonable levels of stress, etc. And so I don't have to focus on it too much, and my program kind of takes care of it. Like I tend to auto regulate my sets, so maybe I'll do like 2 or 3 sets, or 3 to 4 sets, or 2 to 4 sets, or 3 to 5 sets. And if I feel good, I'll do a little bit more. If I'm feeling tired, I'll do a little bit less. And it's kind of as simple as that, Like if I'm feeling a little bit beaten up in a certain area, a little bit crunchy or something, then I'll take it easier. I'll do slightly higher reps, I'll just pump some blood in the area and not do anything really reckless, If someone's like, my hamstring's feeling a little bit tight, like the right one's a little bit, I don't know if it's a tweak or something, but I'd be like, don't listen to that. Max out on RDLs. I'll do a whole bunch of triples with a big stretch at the bottom. It'll be fine. No, like you want to, okay, maybe do a lying hamstring curl for sets of 15 to 20. All right, it's contraction focused. There's not that huge stretch. Go by feel. And usually, if something feels bad and it feels better during the session, it's fine. Right? Like, maybe it was just a little bit of tightness or something. Whereas if something feels bad and it gets worse, that's where it's, you need to really probably just avoid stressing it or straining it more. But, people have kind of lost this ability to go by feel and to make reasonable decisions often. Like as online coaches, you kind of have to give someone a little bit of freedom. I'm sure to make these decisions. Yeah, like in the moment, if someone says, I wasn't really feeling it, like this didn't quite feel 100%, so I skipped this exercise. I'm never like, oh, you should have, like, oh, you went for anything. No, like that's almost always the right decision. And even if it was the wrong decision, it's like a very slightly wrong decision. Like maybe you could have done the movement and it would have been fine, but the benefit you get from that is so small compared to any potential drawback. So yeah, having some flexibility in your program and being able to call a workout or call an exercise or even call a set. I've had times where I knew that I could have done 2 more reps, but it just felt a little bit off, and so I just racked the weight, because it just wasn't really working.
Yeah, you need to learn how to make that call. There's definitely a skill with whether it's auto regulating the frequency, the volume, or even just knowing when to stop the set. And that even ties into what we were talking about with the controlling the cheating and that sort of thing, right? It's a skill because you know where to stop it. Like someone will go up to that deadlift in the example you're talking about earlier about the barbell deadlift. It can get progressively sloppier and grind out some extra reps that are probably not worth it, the added risk or just doing in general. But someone who's really skilled and disciplined, they're going to go to pick up that next rep and they're like, man, this is like, they know, they're like, this is not a
Yeah.
good that's like,
Yeah.
forget about it. I'm walking away from the bar. And that's definitely
Yeah, exactly. For sure. And, or you'll see some super high level deadlifters. I mean, I think Dan Green talked about this recently. Huge fan of his. Again, obviously, enhanced, but like, man, he knows a whole bunch of stuff. He is just a font of lifting wisdom. Yeah, so much. Just he has some really good thoughts about training and not just powerlifting, but hypertrophy as well. I've learned a lot from his articles over the years. Very well written as well. So he said that the deadlift is basically just being able to control your spine, essentially. And we tend to think of like, oh yeah, deadlifts, lower body, it's glutes, it's hamstrings. Well, a lot of the top guys, it's a back exercise. It's a back exercise, it's a core exercise with the legs sort of driving the torso upright, but the torso is absolutely still working. And you look at Dan Green, deadlift 900 pounds and conventional as well, and you can see just the articulation, just every little bit from the lumbar up all the way to his neck is just, it's doing exactly what it needs to do to lift the weight. I mean, he lifts with his erectors, right? And you see him do good mornings. I mean, he's getting rounded over, but it's controlled, and he's staying tight where it needs to stay tight. And man, he knows how to grind as well. And I've seen some sets from him where, you see him pull the first rep. You're like, oh man, he's doing like doubles or something. He gets 8 reps. You're just, whoa, that's amazing. And so, he's been a big inspiration for the set's not done until it's done. And you can kind of evolve that ability to push over time. And if anyone hasn't seen his stuff, just search Dan Green Powerlifter. He has a YouTube channel. I don't know if he's posted recently, but he has a lot of really, really good lifts. Like, just look at his sort of sumo deadlifts for reps, squats for reps.
His deficit stuff, eh? Like, to
anyone.
anyone
His stiff-legged. Yeah.
Anyone who's scared of doing like heavy weights on hip hinges, like, oh, it's gonna hurt my back. Watch Dan Green do like 600-pound stiff leg deadlifts with a deficit.
Yeah, I think it is individual, but it's not that individual. Like, you can build it up over time as long as you progress a little bit by a little bit, a little bit. You look at Atlas Power Shrugged, and he's doing crazy Zercher lifts where he's Jefferson curls where he's totally rounded over, and just hanging out in that bottom position with 3 plates, 4 plates more, I think. And yeah, I think you can build up that capacity. It's just, I think you need to be a little bit more conservative with those lifts compared to others, because I think you're training the muscle, but you're also training the structures, which are just going to take years to adapt in a lot of cases.
Well, and it's kind of a maintenance thing, right? You can't abuse them. You can't abuse the structures. You're like, I gotta have a spine for a really long time, so I better not break it.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I don't think I've ever written the Jefferson curl into a program, just because, if you're not there with them and they mess it up, just there's more repercussions, and not just like in terms of liability or something, just for them, I mean, for me, it's one thing, but for them, I want to make sure they get results, but also make sure that they stay healthy, so there's some movements that they're just not really worth programming, because, if they've done them before and they say they like them, that's one thing. But, if someone's a beginner, I'm not like, okay, we're going to be doing 18 sets of Jefferson curls, all to failure. Remember, partial reps are important. Lengthen position, baby. And, here's your training program. I mean, it's just, it has to be, I think, a little bit more risk averse than that. Again, not even from like a legal perspective, just for what makes sense.
Definitely. And I think, it's clear that neither, like, you're definitely not, and I wouldn't consider myself really anywhere close to the fearmonger side of the spectrum. But at the same time, there are examples of choices you could make in your program and exercises, how much weight to use. You can make irresponsible choices. You can make some rash decisions. Like if you were coaching a beginner and they wanted to do weighted Bulgarian split squats, maybe even eventually work up to like a barbell. That's a great way to overload it, right? You're not going to take a beginner and 1 rep max the Bulgarian split squat at the start. Oh, we need to figure out the percentages, man. Let's do an assessment. It's not a good idea.
Yeah, no, it's some movements just should not have a 1 rep max. Like it just doesn't. Most isolations, any kind of curl, lateral raises, extensions, most rows. I mean, presses you can have a 1 rep max. Squats you can. Deadlifts you can. Pull-ups, I guess you can. But a lot of movements,
maybe not worth it
Yeah.
on the biceps.
yeah, and then a lot of machines as well. I tend to just stick with 5 and up. Like I wouldn't max out on dips just because it puts you in a position where some people can get away with it. You look at Alec on Kiri, who you had on. I mean, he maxes out on dips, feels great. Really good mobility. So you can prepare the body for it.
I think Alex Leonidas and Bald Omni-Man have done that too. They've done like 5 plate dips or something ridiculous.
Yeah, no, like again, you can. And I don't think they are like freaks in terms of what they can get away with on maxing out. I think most people can build up to that if they want to, but it's the building up to it. It's where someone, oh, I haven't done dips in a while. Let's max out on those. That's where you get, because you have that stretch position with the sternum and the clavicles and everything is just sort of stretched back. That's probably one of the reasons it's a good movement, for the chest and front delts and everything. It gets you just the chest wrapping around the rib cage, and it's awesome. I got to get back into dips. But is there anything a 1 rep max gets you for hypertrophy that's special? I would argue no. I would argue probably from a risk to reward standpoint, for most people, 5 and up is probably a good idea. And I just use body weight now. I haven't even added weight in a long time. Maybe I'll toss on a plate, but I usually do them later in the workout. I do them with a very large range of motion to where I'm well below parallel, to where I'm really stretching the chest out, and then I'm pausing at the bottom, and then I'm not like kipping up. That's where you see a lot of people, like you look at Lu Xiaojun, he'll like drive with the head to really get the movement started. And I guess you could argue he's overloading the eccentric and then he's, cheating the concentric, which is what we talked about. But for me, I prefer on those to keep them fairly strict. So on some movements, I cheat more than I used to. And then on other movements, I cheat a lot less. I mean, I've done much more weight on dips, but I find that it's actually more productive to use, just body weight or a little bit more, and then really, open the chest up and get that big stretch.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's a tough balance, right? Trying to make these little decisions on what's appropriate for each exercise. I'll catch myself sometimes, right, where I'm like, yeah, this is the appropriate way to execute this with how many reps and how controlled and how deep. And I build this up in my head. I'm like, I've got it figured out. And then I watch someone that's like way stronger, bigger than me, do it in a way that's different, or like actually do something with more of a cheat. And I'm like, well, he's been getting away with it for 20 years. Is he an anomaly? Like you said, like are those guys we mentioned, are they freaks? I mean, they got freaky good physiques, but are they actually anomalies in terms of their structures and what they can handle? Or is it just that we shouldn't really overthink these things, right? Like there's a lot of room to overthink it. Sure, you can under execute it, but you can also definitely overthink it in many cases.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, and I don't know the exact percentage of people who overthink it versus underthink it. Usually talking to someone for a little while, or getting a client questionnaire, you could tell pretty quick if someone is overthinking things or underthinking things. I would say overthinking is maybe more prevalent, if anything, but that might be just because maybe the type of lifter I attract on the channel is someone who's really detail focused and likes to delve deep into the minutia.
Yeah.
Someone actually left a comment the other day. So I said something like, lifting doesn't have to be that complicated. and someone's like, well, why do you have 400 whatever videos? And I was like, well, okay, well, it was a commenter that I recognized who always leaves dickish comments, right? Like if someone leaves some critical comments and then some, supportive comments, and like they actually have some insights and stuff. But if someone is always kind of a dick, it's. But he had a point. Even he was following that consistently dickish trend. Because
you've got a pretty consistent message though. At the end of the day, you're not trying to lock a secret formula behind a paywall, and like every video is like a little teaser about like, oh, go click on here. Oh, no, you're pretty upfront with what you think. And you're not.
No, it's I think it's important to be as honest as possible, and for a lot of people, their goals don't really require a ton of detail or overthinking things. You just go in, you do a few basic movements, you try to get stronger over time, and that's kind of all you need to get a decent physique for a lot of people. But if you don't, that's where you might have to, analyze things a little bit more. But that can definitely go too far as well. So it's kind of about striking a balance between, executing something and actually seeing it through before thinking about it too much. If you're spending more time on your training log, looking at your spreadsheets or whatever, than actually training, that's where I would say it's a red flag. So, I don't know the exact ratio, but if it's more time than training, definitely something's wrong. Write something down, something reasonable. As Alexander Bromley says, set a baseline of work and then assess over time. Assess after 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks, maybe 12 weeks. And, see the experiment through before you actually, start to say, oh, well, what if I swap this for this? Like, oh, what about this rep range? I think there's lots of room in your training career to sort of have blocks. So, 10-week block, 5 times a year, and just go. That's what Ed Cohn did, I think. And, it worked out pretty well for him.
True. He is the GOAT of powerlifting, some would say. Yeah. Well, and the experimentation on an individual level is so important. And if I were to give my take on it, it's not because, going back to people being different but not that different or being anomalies, it's not because I think that each person or each of my clients is such an anomaly that they need to do this like crazy journey of experimentation to find the thing that works for them. No, it's more like finding a list of things that work, executing them in a way that's sustainable, practical, safe, and effective. And what you're going to find is probably for most people at most stages of the journey, if not all stages, there's more than one right answer. Like there really isn't one good way to program squats or one good way to get jacked arms. These things we can talk about training methods and programs and exercises. There's so many benefits to them, but you'd be hard pressed to convince me personally that there's like exclusive benefits to a particular program or particular way of training, like some magic sauce that this type of squat, but not this type, or this type of curl, but not this type. It's like, well, probably some enormous overlap between the different ways that people train. And as a result, have an open mind when you go into this. And if there are some things you genuinely commit to and they don't work for your body, okay, fine. Adjust accordingly. But what you find isn't the thing. So maybe don't build it up too much in your mind and think, I've got it. No one's ever going to convince me to train differently because I found a way that works. It has to be the one way. No, you probably found one of many effective methods. So just keep an open mind even then. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I've always found it interesting how some people become more dogmatic over time. You see them and just they used to be a little bit open-minded, but now they're just sort of more and more closed off, and it doesn't end well. Other people become less dogmatic over time. They become more open-minded, more open to new ideas. And I'm always curious about, is this a nature thing or a nurture thing? Is this the environment? Did they hear something that opened their mind? Did they, was it the family environment? They were raised a certain way. And, yeah, it is essential, I think, to become more open-minded as you get older, because it's just so easy to get shut in to that one way of thinking. And, you look at something like high intensity training, which is kind of making a comeback. And, what about 2 sets? What about 2 sets? Like you tell me you can't grow on 2 sets. 1 set, okay. 2 sets, no. Too much. Every exercise, same thing. 2 sets, overtraining, not going to recover, excessive. But 1 set, that's where, you're going to grow perfectly for everyone all the time, infinitely. 1 set. And it's easy to sell. It's super simple, right? And sometimes training is simple. And I think it's better to start with a lower volume working hard compared to a high volume and sandbagging, which is what you see on like these sort of simply shredded workouts where it's everything is, 6 sets of 15 for 5 exercises and it's a bro split. And, by the end of it, the effort is just completely down the toilet. I think it's better to start with the lower volume and the higher quality for sure, but you can adapt that over time and you can maybe apply different rules to different exercises based on how they are. Like I think 1 set on an RDL could be pretty reasonable. Like I'll often do 1 to 3 sets, maybe 1 to 4 sets on RDLs. If I do that first set and I'm super happy with the quality and the effort was really, really there, and I can feel that set got me what I needed out of that set, out of that exercise, then I just call it there. Because I know a second set would just be too much. Because I've been there to where I plateaued when I did 2 of those kinds of sets. On the other hand, sometimes the first set, maybe I wasn't fully warmed up or I just didn't quite feel as good. And I knew that it wasn't the same quality of effort. And so I do a second set. And sometimes I don't get there on the second set and I need a third set. And then very rarely a fourth set. But usually it's like 2 to 3 sets. But yeah, sometimes it's just 1 set. But I don't think I would get that same feeling on like a rear delt cable fly or something, where I finish that 1 set and it's like, yep, I got everything I wanted out of that. Just for me, it's a more resilient muscle group. It's a smaller amount of muscle. It's a less stressful exercise. It's a less risky exercise. And so, that's more like a 3 to 5 set type of situation, because I can handle more and benefit from more. So it's not just about what you can recover from, it's what you can benefit from as well. And yeah, these high intensity guys, man, they know that they're going to make money selling this kind of stuff because it's very marketable, but it's certainly not the truth. And a lot of them are very charismatic. And sometimes I have trouble figuring out, do they know they're full of shit? Like, have they drunk the Kool-Aid so much that they actually believe it? Or is this just something that they know is bullshit and they're just trying to sell it to other people? Because sometimes you see people saying a certain way of training is the best, and then you look at their old training footage, how they built their physique, and it's totally different from what they do now or what they say they do now. And so, there are rumors of Menzer sneaking in to get in more training or doing his warm-ups pretty damn hard, suspiciously like working sets, that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it's I always have a hard time figuring out if do they actually believe it or is it just marketing?
Yeah, there's nuance to all the training systems, and there's room to take any good, effective training system and then just try and like iron it in as a neat package and say this is the way it can be, proclaimed. Because if you spend a lot of time talking about the nuance, you kind of lose people's attention, right? So I could see where if someone has that training style, they could break it down to like, a 30-second spiel, an elevator pitch, and then that's the training system, right? That's the appeal for a lot of training systems is you get it in this nice, neat pack. Hey, just do 5x5, man. Just 5x5. Simple. It's like
I was about to say, yeah, like there's a reason 5x5 is not 5x4 or 4x5. I mean, 5x5. Oh, it rolls off the tongue. Oh, I heard a 5x5. Like, and is 5x5 going to be more effective than a 4x4 or 6x6 or 5x4 or any 4 to 6 reps or 4 to 6 sets of 4 to 6 reps, right? It's
Similar
all the
volume
same.
training.
Yeah, it's the same stuff, but it's just,
Yeah.
it's
Actually,
marketed like
the
that.
hit one's interesting. I'm hoping to have, if he'll be a guest on. There's a guy, John Hart. He was trained by Mike, and he won Mr. America, and then there was another competition he won, NATTY. So he's a NATTY guy that worked with him, and I think he actually worked for him. He's got a YouTube channel, Mr. America Hart. He's made some interesting videos, so it'd be cool to have an actual that's an actual hit guy to have on. So that'd be interesting to talk
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, I think it can be effective, but it's more about the fact that the set is really, really hard
Yeah.
compared to just that one set.
Just
Or
us,
like if they,
right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like it's not the one set; it's the fact that the one set is really, really hard, and most people they just don't train that hard. And so when you scrap their whole training plan, and then you know, give them one set, well, that one set might actually be more effective than the pile of BS that they've been doing. They see results, and then they're indoctrinated, and then they start selling it to other people. And it can be effective, but it's it doesn't mean it's going to be the most effective. Right?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to hopefully hearing his thoughts because I've seen some good nuanced takes in his where he would talk about training clients and it would be sometimes 3 or sometimes 2 or sometimes 1 and sometimes 2 sets. And the client would ask, "Hey, why is that?" Well, because the change in effort. Like the whole thing we've been talking about with auto regulation. So those concepts aren't even necessarily lost on the people that have those types of like systems to sell. And that might even be the case for Mark Ripperton. I mean, maybe if someone's worked with Mark Rip or just a starting strength coach in general, they could tell us about some of the nuance to it. I'd be interested to hear it. But these things become memes at a certain point, and then that's how people know it is like the meme more than the actual like person behind it, the brain behind it. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The point is I think what we're trying to get across is it's worth thinking critically about all the decisions, even when they're popular, like that type of training, or they're effective. It's like if you do one set and it's effective, like Geoffrey's saying on this RDL, that doesn't mean that's like exclusively the way to train RDLs. But there's a time and a place where it can be, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's I don't know. I think it's going to be a journey that everyone has to sort of go on by themselves or with their coach. And people should probably be ready for that to take 5 years, probably realistically at least. I mean, some people can get used to that and really nail things in their first year, but then the body changes and you have to sort of be observant and you can't just ever go through the motions and think you're done with your training plan because you're adapting. It's a biological system. Every day is going to be different. Every month is going to be different. Every year is going to be different. And my plan will have to be different in 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years, and 50 years compared to now. That's just the reality of how it is. And there's no substitute, no meta-analysis that you can whip out for just being present and being in the moment and going by feel and being observant.
Absolutely. So one last big question I'd like to ask you, Geoffrey. How do you keep defeating the natty limit? What's your secret?
Actually, yeah, I just had a video out about that. And I think, it's one of those things where if you get to a limit, there's always going to be a way over that limit, like that theoretical limit. Like you mean like there's no way you could gain even half a pound of muscle or 1 pound of muscle. I mean, there's going to be some area of the body you haven't trained, or there's going to be some technique you haven't tried, or there's going to be some way of recovering better, or some way to tweak your diet. And so there's always a way to make progress, right? And sure, maybe there's like a theoretical limit. What if you did everything perfectly from birth? Sure, you'd see diminishing returns and you'd plateau because it is an equilibrium. You'd plateau at a certain point. Or at least, it would be a visible plateau. Maybe you were still gaining muscle, but I mean, if you gain half a pound of muscle a year, that's difficult to see at that point. And so I think at a certain point, maybe you're still growing, but you just can't see it. Or you pick up injuries and you have to work around those, which limit what you can do. Or sometimes you're just done. Like you're just happy with your physique and you're just, you maintain it. And the good news is maintaining is fairly easy compared to gaining. And you can, some people just are happy to, train for 5 years, get to that level, and then maintain. The issue I have is when they're like, yeah, I hit my limit, and then I hit my natty limit. Well, you hit a limit based on your preferences and based on your choices, but there wasn't some kind of ultimate limit or biological limit. I mean, it's not like the muscle has a predetermined amount that it can grow. Yeah, I don't see how that would be the case. It's more a limitation of the time and the effort that you put in, and the other limiting factors, not necessarily like a hard cap on biology. And you do see a lot of guys float to roughly the same level of muscularity in terms of FFMI, fat-free mass index. You see a lot of the top naturals float to like 24, 25, 26-ish or so FFMI. But I don't think there's anything magical about this. I think that just for guys with good genetics who put in a lot of work, that's where you get very, very, very diminishing returns. And so a lot of guys just seem to float to that area. But a lot of them are still making progress, visible progress, as we keep learning, as we keep experimenting, as we build the community, we build ourselves and build each other up. And so, I've found that gains have slowed down, but they're still happening, maybe a little bit more slowly. But I mean, another good thing is that every pound of muscle that you gain is more valuable than the last, because you're going into more and more rarefied territory. Like if you go from, let's say, to give people numbers, and you can search like FFMI calculator and input your height, your weight, and your body fat percentage, and that'll spit out FFMI. If you get a weirdly high number, it means that the body fat percentage was a little bit optimistic, which means that you thought your body fat amount was lower, which overestimated the amount of muscle that you thought you had. And so if someone goes from, say, 18 FFMI, which is roughly what a beginner would often be at, to 19 FFMI, they'll look visibly more jacked, but it's still not that impressive. Where if someone goes from, I'm around 24 FFMI, if I went from 24 to 25, that would be very, very visible, because I'm going into a place where fewer people are, right? And this has kind of been blurred with steroids, where there are people with like 40 FFMI and 35 FFMI. It's just like stupid amounts of muscle. I think at that point, no one's going to argue that a natural lifter is going to get to 40 FFMI, like Rolly Winkler or something, where they're 300 pounds and lean at 5'6" or something, and just, ridiculously muscle, just like a complete ball of muscle. And I mean, yeah, that's beyond the limits of what you can do naturally. I don't think most people are going to argue that, that's possible. So, there's going to be some place between there, right? Between 25 FMI, which we know naturals can go beyond. We've seen them before, especially if you allow your body fat percentage to go up. You can hold quite a bit of lean body mass. You look at sumo wrestlers, etc. The trouble is holding it down when you lean down. That's a big issue, especially as naturals who don't have that hormonal assistance. So it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 40. It's a big range, but it's going to be somewhere in there. We don't know where. It's going to be individual anyway. And so basically just enjoy the process. Don't focus too much on where you're going to end up. I'm not up at night thinking like, man, am I 25.5 or 26? Like, where am I going to end up? I don't know, man. Like, tossing and turning, trying to whipping out the calculator, inputting some numbers. Man, what if I do this curl instead? What about this rep range? No, I'm just much more process focused than goal focused. I see a lot of people who are very goal focused. They never do well. They never do well. They never last. They never really even go more than a few months in a lot of cases of training. And that's because goal focus is just not the way to go. You want to be process focused for sure. You can have goals, that's fine, but just enjoy the training, make it sustainable, do the movements that you like, and you'll kind of end up where you end up. And if you're not happy with that, well, that's just where you end up. And where someone ends up might not be the same place as me, and that's totally fine. Lifting is still something so beneficial to your life, to your health, to your well-being, that even if you end up at 21 FFMI or something, that's totally fine. It's still worth doing, particularly if you enjoy the process. So I see some people where they're kind of disappointed by the results, and they're kind of focused on the wrong thing in a lot of cases. If I had been goal focused, I probably would have stopped years ago. Because the minute you hit a plateau, you're like, oh, well, I guess I'm done. But if you're process focused, you can sort of drive through that just by improving how you do things.
Wonderful. And you are, one of the, like, fortunately, many examples that are coming up on social media these days of naturals who are defying expectations. Like, truly, as terms of physique, and we see a lot of guys even with strength. I had Max Sheeler on, 800-pound deadlift natty. Obviously, he's at a high body weight and higher body fat than you are. But point is, ridiculous things are done. There probably are, just as you said, 40. Hey, let's call it unrealistic, if nothing else. But point is, you're not going to know until you try. So, yeah, I really agree with the sentiment and what you said there.
Yeah, and it's a shame because I see some guys on Instagram where I look at their physique and they have natural in the bio or they're claiming natural. And I look at their physique and I'm like, yeah, I believe it. Like, that makes a lot of sense. I could see that physique being natural. And then I look at the comments and they're just like, what about the steroids you take? Or what about, talk about your juice head. And I'm just sitting there thinking, and maybe they're defending themselves in the comments, and I'm just sitting there thinking, like, man, they don't look that ridiculous. Like, they're not that much bigger than me. And 5 years ago, I might have been thinking, oh, okay, well, they look a little bit suspect. But once you get to that point yourself, and you realize like you're within shooting distance of some of these physiques that you thought were unbelievable a few years ago, it kind of opens your eyes to what is actually possible. And so a lot of the negative comments that I see, they're from beginners. They're from beginners who watched a few too many natty or knots, or they tried lifting a little bit, but they didn't get the results they wanted, and then they hopped on sauce, and so now they think that anyone with a decent physique, like if you have abs and a biceps vein, clearly on something, right? And so they can't accept that anyone would look better than them naturally, even though they hopped on, and they're kind of bitter about it. And they're not only saucy, but they're salty as well. And so
They are salty.
yeah.
And so, have you noticed this too? The haters tend to be like two kind of extreme things. It's like either you're too small to look good, maybe it's bad lighting, whatever. Everyone knows lighting, pump makes a big difference and all that, leanness. But it's like you're either like too unimpressive and they're like, you're Mr. Shrimp Toast. And then by the time you have that nice saucy looking photo, it's like 2 years later, it's like, oh, now he's on steroids. So it's like you're either like small and weak or you're on steroids with some of these haters,
Yeah. And I've even had the same person say both of those to me in the same interaction. They're like, you're not that impressive. And I'm like, well, actually, here are my stats. Like, they're pretty good for an natural. Like, I'm pretty jacked. He's like, well, you're on steroids, so it's not that impressive. Like, okay, sure, okay. Like, anything you want to say to try to convince yourself, and it's impossible to defend yourself because once someone has decided, I've convinced a few people. One guy was like, oh, you're on juice. I'm like, well, actually, I'm not. You can go back and look at my progression over the past few years. And actually, he a few hours later, he's like, actually, I'd like to apologize. I think actually your progression looks pretty reasonable, and I think actually you might be natural. I apologize. And I was like, whoa, that is an internet first. That's never happened before on the internet, and probably won't happen again. Because usually it's just they see one picture and they're like, well, yeah, what about the juice you take or something, or like, why don't you talk about steroids? Usually it's not a direct accusation. It's just something like some roundabout way, like, what about the steroids? Talk about the trend, that kind of thing. And once someone has decided that, the more you try to convince them, the more they're like, this is exactly what a fake natty would say. Of course, you're trying to, oh, you're being defensive. I called you a lying sack of shit and you're being defensive. Clearly guilty.
That's right. They're gonna have to wait for the Geoffrey stack to be revealed. Not yet. It's too soon.
Yeah, it's well, it's a pretty light stack. It's protein powder, creatine, and occasionally fish oil. I really only use the fish oil to prop up my camera. I don't actually take the pills. I just I just use the bottle. That's the extent of the stack.
Wonderful. And then as far as coaching and books and your channel, where can people find you, and are you currently taking on clients?
I am taking on clients, but I have to be careful about how I phrase this, because if I say like only a few, I just get a rush. But it really is, I don't usually mention coaching too much, because it gets excessive. And I want to focus, sort of split my time between YouTube and coaching. But yes, there are spots, but like if only a few % of people who hear this could inquire, that would be like a tiny sliver. That would be fantastic. So if you're on the fence, get off the fence and go buy my books instead. Those will actually be very, very useful, much more affordable as well, and they will steer you right. Plus, they are infinitely scalable, and so they don't take up my time. So you can find those at verityfit.com.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today. I thought it was a real pleasure, so hope you enjoyed it as well. And to the audience, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.
Thanks for having me.